The February wind cut through Bitter Creek like a cavalry saber carrying the bitter scent of wood smoke and human desperation. Mud mixed with frost cracked under boots as townsfolk gathered in the main street, their breath rising in ghostly columns against the pewter morning sky. The makeshift auction block, 3 weathered crates stacked against Henley's Mercantile, stood like a scaffold in the weak sunlight that filtered through gathering storm clouds. Next lot. Sheriff Pike announced, his gravelly voice cutting through the crowd's restless murmur. He was a barrel-chested man, wrapped in a thick woolen coat, steel-gray eyes surveying the assembly with the weary patience of someone who had witnessed too many such proceedings. His right hand rested with practiced ease on his Colt's grip, more from habit than expectation of trouble. Outstanding debts of Heinrich Muller, deceased. 1 widow woman, age 24. 1 male infant, approximately 8 months. Winona Mueller stepped forward on unsteady legs, her cheeks burned raw by wind and sleepless worry. Her once blue dress had faded to the color of old bruises, the hem torn and hastily mended with whatever scraps she could find. She clutched her infant son Henrik against her chest, the child wrapped in a threadbare blanket that had seen too many harsh Wyoming winters. Dark hair escaped from beneath her knitted cap, whipping around a face that held fierce dignity despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Her lips moved in silent German prayer. Bitte hilf uns jetzt, the words of her childhood faith, offering little comfort against the brutal reality of frontier justice. Banker Mallory stood beside Pike, like death keeping meticulous accounts, a gaunt scarecrow of a man in a black suit that made him resemble an undertaker more than a financier. He brandished a leather-bound ledger like a weapon of righteous damnation, his pale fingers caressing the pages where human misery had been reduced to neat columns of figures. Debts totaled $237. He called out, his nasal voice slicing through the cold air with the precision of a surgical blade. Mine collapse equipment, rental medical expenses for the rescue attempt, winter provisions advanced on credit during the husband's extended illness. Terms of indenture to be negotiated with a successful bidder. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, boots scraping against frozen earth. Debt auctions had become commonplace since the drought began 3 years prior. But something about a nursing mother and helpless infant made even the hardest settlers uneasy. The practice walked a razor-thin line between territorial law and moral bankruptcy. "Now this ain't right," muttered old Tom Henley from his mercantile doorway, his breath forming white puffs as he spoke. "Ain't Christian to auction off a woman with a suckling babe like she was livestock. Christian sentiment don't pay legitimate debts, Tom." Mallory snapped back his patience, wearing thin with moral objections to his profitable schemes. The law, as they claimed, though it was only the color of law clear as scripture, and outstanding obligations must be satisfied according to territorial statute. $50 for 1 season's work, called out Jakob Bauer, a lean homesteader, whose own coat was patched with flour sacking, and whose hollow cheeks spoke of too many meals missed to feed his children. His young son Hans stood beside him, wide blue eyes, taking in proceedings that would shape his understanding of justice for years to come. "I work hard, Ja, she can help me and wife with the cooking, the boy can play with Hans." $75 for 2 seasons, countered Morton Hayes, a grizzled prospector with gold teeth that glinted when he smiled, and calculating eyes that appraised Winona like prime breeding stock. "Got a good solid cabin up in the hills, plenty of work for a woman who ain't afraid of earning her keep the hard way." Dr. Eliza Hart pushed through the crowd. Like a small, fierce tornado, her worn medical bag clutched tight against her wool coat. She was a woman in her 50s, who had come west after losing her husband to consumption, trading the comfort of civilized society for the harsh freedom of the frontier. "You cannot indenture a nursing child," she called out, her voice carrying the hard-earned authority of someone who had delivered half the babies in the territory. and buried too many of their mothers. It's against territorial law and every principle of common decency. The law says debts must be satisfied, Doc. Pike countered, though his voice carried little conviction, and his eyes avoided meeting Hart's direct stare. You want to pay her obligations yourself. Hart's silence spoke volumes about her own limited resources. A country doctor's income barely covered medical supplies, let alone the crushing debt that Mallory's ledger demanded. The crowd's murmur grew uglier as more bids were called out, each treating mother and child like property to be bartered. Through the assembled townspeople came the measured sound of hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, as a funeral march. The crowd parted like water before the prow of a ship, as a lone rider emerged from the morning mist that clung to Bitter Creek's muddy banks. He threw back a fox fur hood, revealing features that marked him unmistakably as Lakota high cheekbones carved by wind and weather copper skin that spoke of countless seasons under the open sky, black hair braided with strips of leather and adorned with eagle feathers that had witnessed too many battles and migrations. As Keme's dark eyes swept the crowd and settled on Winona, something flickered deep in his memory, a flash of recognition that struck him like lightning, illuminating a landscape he thought forgotten. Those same determined brown eyes, that same stubborn tilt of the chin, but smaller younger belonging to a terrified 6-year-old girl who had dragged a bleeding Lakota boy into the reeds beside a burning wagon train 20 years ago. While bullets flew overhead like angry hornets, her small hands had used mud and torn cloth to stop his bleeding her eyes, holding the same fierce courage they showed now. Could it be? After all these years, Keme dismounted from his paint horse with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle, his movements economical and precise. He wore buckskin leggings beneath a long coat of traded wool, and a worn Remington rifle rested across his back like an old trusted friend. Every line of his body spoke of controlled violence held in careful check. "I'll take them," he said, his voice steady and clear as mountain water flowing over stone. The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. Then 3 rifles cocked with metallic clicks that echoed off the false-fronted buildings lining the street, the sound sharp as breaking bones in the cold air. Pike's hand inched toward his holster, while riflemen on the boardwalks took deliberate aim at the Lakota Warrior standing exposed in the center of town. "You got no business here, Indian," Pike said, though his voice wavered like a man walking on thin ice. "This is white folks' law, white folks' business." "I have coin," Keme replied simply, his right hand open and visible his left resting near but not on his rifle. "Your auction is for the highest bidder, is it not? Or does territorial law specify the color of legal tender?" Winona shifted Henrik to one arm and stepped slightly closer to Keme's shadow, an instinctive movement that didn't escape the notice of watching eyes. The warrior's position blocked several lines of fire aimed at her, and she seemed to understand his protection without words being spoken between them. "Can't let no savage take custody of decent white folk." Hayes spat his gold teeth, glinting with malice. "It ain't natural, nor legal, nor proper. What's to stop him from selling them to hostiles across the territorial border?" "Since when did you become a territorial lawyer, Hayes?" Dr. Hart interjected sharply, her voice cutting through the ugly murmur of agreement from several quarters. "Last I heard, the law don't specify race when it comes to paying legitimate debts. Money is money, regardless of whose pocket it comes from." Schoolmaster Finch appeared at the crowd's edge, his ever-present notebook already in hand. He was a thin, scholarly man who had appointed himself the town's unofficial recorder of legal proceedings, partly from civic duty, partly from the journalist's instincts that had brought him west in search of stories worth telling. "Dr. Hart speaks the truth," he said, his normally timid voice gaining unexpected strength. I've made it my business to read the territorial statutes thoroughly. Legal tender is legal tender regardless of who offers it. The law makes no racial distinctions in matters of debt satisfaction. Mallory's pale eyes gleamed with barely contained avarice as he calculated potential profit margins. A paying customer was a paying customer, regardless of moral objections from squeamish townspeople. "How much coin you got, Indian? And it better be real silver, not some worthless tribal tokens." Kame reached into his saddlebags with deliberate movements, producing a leather pouch heavy with silver dollars and several gold pieces that caught the weak sunlight like captured fire. He poured the coins onto a nearby barrel, the metal ringing against wood like church bells, announcing either salvation or damnation. $250, he announced quietly. "I assume the debt in full and take custody of both woman and child." The crowd stirred uneasily, a ripple of shocked murmurs passing through the assembly like wind through wheat. It was more money than most families saw in a year of backbreaking labor, enough to pay Mallory's usurious demands and still leave change. But having a Lakota warrior assume legal custody of a white woman and her infant raised questions that touched on fears and prejudices running as deep as the territorial bedrock. "Count it," Kame said with the quiet confidence of a man whose word was his bond. Mallory's fingers flew through the coins with the practiced greed of someone who had devoted his life to the accumulation of wealth regardless of its human cost. His pale lips moved as he calculated, and his eyes widened slightly at the total. $253, he announced, unable to hide his satisfaction at this unexpected windfall that would more than satisfy the ledger's demands. "Hold on just a minute," Pike protested, but his objection lacked force. The law was clear, even if its application in this case made him profoundly uncomfortable. "I need your mark on the papers," Mallory said, producing documents from his coat with the theatrical flourish of a stage magician, revealing his final trick. "Standard territorial indenture agreement. The woman and child become your legal responsibility, with all the obligations and privileges that status implies." As Kame took the pen Mallory offered and made a careful mark beside his name, written in the banker's spidery handwriting, Winona stepped closer. Her voice was barely audible over the wind that was beginning to pick up force. "I won't be bound like property," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear, in startling contrast to the bitter air around them. "You won't be abandoned," he replied carefully, avoiding her gaze as he spoke that particular word which carried far too much weight from their shared past. The crowd began to disperse as the sham auction staged under color of law concluded, but tension remained thick in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. As they walked toward Dr. Hart's clinic, where Kemi had hastily arranged temporary shelter, Winona spoke again with the directness that had marked her character since childhood. "Why?" she asked her question, encompassing not just his intervention, but 20 years of silence between them. After all this time, why now? Keme was quiet for a long moment, his memory filled with images of a small girl with fierce eyes and gentle hands who had saved his life when she was barely old enough to understand what death meant. "Because I could," he said finally, "and because I should have found you long before this." That night brought trouble, like winter brings snow, inevitable and bitter. A brick shattered Dr. Hart's front window with the violence of a gunshot glass, scattering across the floor like deadly diamonds. Wrapped around the projectile was a crudely written note. "Let the sham auction staged under color of law stand. Some things shouldn't be changed by outsiders who don't belong." Dr. Hart swept up the glass with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with frontier justice in all its ugly forms, while Keme checked the street outside with the wariness of a man who had learned that safety was always temporary on the frontier. The night seemed empty, except for the wind moaning through gaps in the buildings, but he could feel hostile eyes watching from the shadows. In the back room, Winona had managed to settle Henrik by the clinic's wood stove, but the stress of recent events had affected her milk supply. The infant's hungry cries pierced the night like accusations, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't provide what her child needed most. "There are ways," Keme said gently, kneeling beside the makeshift cradle fashioned from Dr. Hart's medical bag. "My wife knew methods for when milk failed during the hardest winters." Winona's eyes snapped to his face with the sharp attention of someone hearing unexpected information. "Your wife, she died 2 winters ago," he said quietly, his voice carrying grief that time had softened but not erased. "Lung fever took her when the medicine couldn't reach our camp in time. We tried for children, but—" He shrugged the gesture, speaking of losses too deep for words. The spirits had other plans. The admission hung between them like smoke from Hart's dying fire, heavy with unspoken sorrow, and the kind of loss that carved permanent channels in a person's soul. Near midnight, Keme met Sergeant Webb in the alley behind Peterson's blacksmith shop, where the smell of cold iron and dead coals provided cover for conversations that couldn't bear witness. Webb was a career soldier with 20 years of frontier service etched into his weathered face. Like scars, a man whose loyalty to the Army was supposed to be absolute, but whose methods often operated in moral gray areas that kept his commanding officers awake at night. "Found tracks leading toward the old Consolidated mine," Webb said without preamble, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Horse thieves are using the abandoned workings to hide stolen animals before moving them south to Colorado buyers. I need you to scout the area tomorrow. Numbers, defenses, escape routes. Standard reconnaissance." Something about Webb's demeanor troubled Keme like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. The sergeant's boots were caked with distinctive red mud from the north ford of Bitter Creek, which seemed odd since Webb claimed to have approached the mine area from the southern approach, where the terrain was easier and the risk of observation much lower. "What about the woman and child?" Keme asked, testing the waters of Webb's interest in his personal arrangements. "Your responsibility now," Webb replied with studied indifference that seemed almost theatrical. "But don't let personal matters interfere with your duties to the United States Army. We have important work to do, and it takes precedence over everything else." As Webb walked away, his gait favoring his left leg slightly, the result of an old Sioux arrow wound that only acted up when he'd been riding hard over rough terrain for extended periods. The details suggested the sergeant had been doing considerably more than examining horse tracks from a comfortable distance. Dawn brought frost that transformed Bitter Creek's main street into a treacherous sheet of ice, making walking hazardous and riding potentially fatal. The broken window at Dr. Hart's clinic had been boarded up during the night. But the message behind the vandalism was clear. As morning light, some elements in town didn't approve of the previous day's resolution and were prepared to take action to reverse it. Mallory had been busy during the dark hours spreading rumors through the saloons and boarding houses, like a man sowing poisonous seeds in fertile ground. By sunrise, half the town believed Winona possessed a detailed map to Heinrich's secret silver cache, while the other half were convinced Keme was planning to sell her and the baby to hostile Indian bands across the territorial border. "There's going to be trouble," Dr. Hart warned as she prepared her morning medical rounds, checking her bag to ensure she had supplies for treating the kinds of injuries that occurred when men let fear and prejudice guide their actions. Pike's calling for a rehearing of the sham auction staged under color of law claims there were procedural irregularities that void the legal transfer. Keme was methodically cleaning his rifle. When she spoke, his movements precise as a man who understood that his life might depend on the weapon's reliability before the day was over. What kind of irregularities? The kind that let them void your legal standing and take the woman back. Hart replied with the grim honesty of someone who had watched frontier justice operate according to convenience rather than law. Mallory's been whispering poison about your fitness as a guardian, questioning whether an Indian can legally assume custody of white citizens under territorial statutes. He's found some obscure provisions that might give him leverage. Through the boarded window, they could hear the sound of men gathering in the street, their voices carrying the ugly undertone that preceded vigilante action. Some seemed merely curious about the morning's potential entertainment, but others carried the sharp edge of anger, looking for a convenient target. Winona appeared in the doorway, holding Henrik against her shoulder. The infant's face was red from crying that had continued through most of the night, and dark circles under her eyes spoke of a mother's exhaustion and growing desperation. "We should look at Heinrich's papers," she said quietly, her voice carrying something that hadn't been there before, a subtle hardness, as if she had made some internal decision during the sleepless hours. "His geological reports from the mine. There might be something there that explains why this is happening." She reached into Henrik's swaddling and withdrew a small oilskin packet that had been hidden against the baby's warm body. Inside were Heinrich's final assay reports and survey notes written in her dead husband's careful German script, along with a rough sketch of the mine's tunnel system. As Keme examined the documents, he noticed something odd. The official reports showed declining silver yields that would explain the mine's closure, but hidden among the technical notations were brief entries in a different hand notes that seemed to be written in code or cipher. "What do these mean?" he asked, pointing to the cryptic markings. Winona studied the papers with growing unease. Heinrich was frightened those last few weeks before the accident. He worked longer hours but spoke less about what he was doing. "These notes?" She traced the strange symbols with her finger. "I think he was trying to document something without putting it in plain writing. Something dangerous enough that he didn't dare record it openly." The sound of boots on the clinic's front steps interrupted their conversation, followed by Pike's voice carrying through the boarded window with official authority that barely concealed personal uncertainty. "Open up in there. This is official territorial business, and I've got papers that need serving." "Back door," Dr. Hart whispered urgently, already moving toward the rear of the building. "There's a path through the willows that leads down to the creek. If you can reach the water, you might be able to lose them in the rough country upstream." They slipped out into the gray morning that promised more snow before nightfall. Winona clutching Henrik, while Keme carried their few possessions and Heinrich's precious documents. The narrow path was slippery with frost, winding through bare willow branches that provided scant cover from watching eyes, but represented their only hope of escape. Behind them, Pike's voice grew louder as he discovered their absence, his orders carrying clearly in the cold air. "Find them. They can't have gone far with a baby slowing them down. Search every building, every hiding place." The creek ran low between banks of dirty ice, its surface partially frozen, but still flowing in the center channel where the current was too strong for winter to completely conquer. Keme led them upstream away from town and toward the rough country where pursuit would be more difficult, but the going was treacherous on rocks made slippery by ice and morning frost. Winona's worn boots provided little grip on the slick stones, and Henrik's weight made balance difficult as she tried to navigate obstacles that would have challenged an experienced woodsman. Her breath came in short puffs that showed white in the frigid air, and Kime could see that she was already beginning to tire from the unaccustomed exertion. A rifle shot cracked through the cold air, like breaking timber, sending ice chips flying from a boulder near Winona's head with deadly accuracy. Two men emerged from the brush on the opposite bank drifters by their rough appearance, armed with old military rifles, and motivated by whatever bounty Mallory had offered for their capture. "There they are," one called out, with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. The Indian and the German woman with her bastard child. Kime pushed Winona toward a stand of cattails while he sought cover behind a fallen log that offered protection from small arms fire, but wouldn't stop a determined assault. The men were working their way down to the water with the confidence of predators who had cornered their quarry and were simply choosing the best angle for the killing shot. "Can you swim?" Kime asked urgently, evaluating their rapidly diminishing options for escape. "With Henrik in water this cold?" Winona's voice was tight with fear that had nothing to do with her own safety and everything to do with her child's survival. The ice beneath their feet began to crack ominously under their combined weight, producing sounds like gunshots that echoed off the water and advertised their position to anyone within hearing. The pond, created by an old beaver dam, was only partially frozen, and the morning sun had weakened the surface enough that it might not support them much longer. Another shot split the morning air, sending cattail fluff flying like snow, while the bullet passed close enough to Kime's head that he could feel its wind. He returned fire with his Remington, the shot echoing off the water and forcing the drifters to take cover behind rocks and tree stumps. But he knew they were trapped like animals in a pen. "Hold on to Henrik tight," he ordered, then grabbed Winona around the waist just as the ice gave way completely beneath their feet. The shock of the frigid water drove the breath from their lungs like a physical blow, and Kime fought desperately to keep all three of them above the surface, while bullets churned the water around them like hail from hell. His feet found the muddy bottom after what seemed like an eternity, and he half-dragged, half-carried Winona toward the reedy shallows on the far side of the pond. They emerged, gasping and shivering violently, their clothes instantly beginning to freeze in the bitter air, while Henrik's cries grew weak from cold and shock. Kime fired twice more across the water, forcing the drifters to retreat up the bank, while arguing loudly about whether to pursue across the treacherous ice or return to town for reinforcements and warmer clothes. "We need warmth quickly." Winona gasped through lips that were already turning blue with the onset of hypothermia. Kime pulled off his heavy coat despite the cold and wrapped it around both Winona and Henrik, then held them close against his chest, while his body heat combined with the insulation of wet wool to slow their descent into freezing death. Winona's hand pressed against his chest, and he could feel her heartbeat gradually slowing from its panicked rhythm as shared warmth began to drive back the killing cold. "Your hands are shaking," she observed through chattering teeth, her voice muffled by the coat wrapped around her head. "From the cold," he replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The touch of her body against his awakened feelings he had thought buried with his wife, and the responsibility of protecting her and Henrik stirred emotions that had nothing to do with old debts and everything to do with something he didn't dare name. They needed to reach shelter before hypothermia claimed them all, but more importantly, they needed to understand what Heinrich had discovered that was worth killing for. The coded notes in his reports were the key to everything, and until they could decipher their meaning, then they would remain fugitives, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The abandoned, consolidated mine, perched on the hillside like a wound in the earth, that refused to heal its dark mouth surrounded by scattered timbers and snow-dusted tailings that spoke of dreams turned to dust and fortunes, lost to the unforgiving ground. Wooden support structures jutted from the slope at odd angles like the ribs of some massive skeleton, and rusted equipment lay half-buried in decades of accumulated debris. But what caught Kime's attention immediately were the fresh details that didn't belong in a supposedly abandoned operation. Neat stacks of powder kegs arranged near the entrance with military precision horse tracks in the snow that were far too recent and numerous for casual visitors, and the faint smell of wood smoke that suggested someone had been maintaining fires in the depths below. Kame and Winona approached carefully through the scattered boulders and scrub pine that provided cover from observation, their clothes still damp from the creek crossing, but no longer frozen solid thanks to the afternoon sun that had finally burned through the morning's overcast. Henrik had stopped crying and now slept fitfully against his mother's chest, wrapped in layers of improvised insulation that included Kame's spare shirt and a wool blanket he'd retrieved from his saddlebags. Someone's been working here recently, Kimi observed quietly, pointing to the fresh sign around the mine's entrance. Too many horses for legitimate mining operations, and those are army horseshoes, not civilian. Before Winona could respond, Deputy Jesse Vale emerged from the shadows of a ruined equipment shed, like a ghost materializing from guilty conscience. The young lawman's face was pale with cold, and something that looked suspiciously like shame. His usual swagger replaced by the nervous energy of a man who had made choices he was struggling to live with. "Figured you'd come here eventually," Vale said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of relief and resignation. "Been waiting since first light, thinking things through, trying to decide what kind of man I want to be." Kame's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Vale raised his free hand in a gesture of peace that seemed genuine despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "I'm not here to arrest you." The deputy continued, his words coming faster, as if he needed to get them out before his courage failed. "I'm here to warn you, and maybe to help you understand what you've stumbled into." "What do you mean?" Winona asked, shifting Henrik to her other arm, while keeping her distance from Vale, in case his apparent change of heart proved to be an elaborate trap. Vale's shoulders slumped, like a man carrying a weight too heavy for his frame. "There's things happening in this mine that ain't got nothing to do with silver or legitimate mining. Things that would make your blood run cold if you knew the full scope of them." He looked older than his 25 years, worn down by circumstances that had tested his character and found it wanting. "But before I tell you what I know, you need to see what's down there for yourselves. Evidence that'll make you understand why so many people are willing to kill to keep their secrets buried." The entrance to the mine yawned before them, like the mouth of hell itself. And somewhere in its depths lay the answers to questions that had already cost Heinrich Müller his life. But as they prepared to descend into the darkness, none of them could have imagined the full scope of the horror they were about to uncover. The main tunnel stretched into blackness that seemed to swallow their lamplight like a living thing. Water dripped from the ceiling with the persistence of a funeral bell, and their footsteps echoed off the stone walls with sounds that might have been whispers from the dead. The air grew warmer as they descended, but it carried odors that spoke of things better left undisturbed, decay, fear, and the metallic scent of spilled blood. The side tunnel Heinrich mapped should be just ahead. Winona whispered, consulting her husband's rough sketch by the wavering light of Vale's oil lamp. He wrote that it connects to a natural chamber he'd never seen marked on the official survey. They moved carefully through the suffocating darkness, following Heinrich's carefully drawn path, while trying to avoid loose stones that might betray their presence to anyone else who might be lurking in the tunnel system. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their own breathing, and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures disturbed by their passage. The side tunnel opened into a chamber that took their breath away and chilled their blood. By the light of several oil lamps hung on wooden supports, they could see evidence of activities that had nothing to do with legitimate mining operations. Army saddles were stacked near barrels of grain, and a dozen cavalry mounts stood in makeshift stalls carved from the living rock, their coats bearing the distinctive brands of the 7th Cavalry. But it was what lay scattered on a makeshift table that made Winona gasp and Kame's hand tighten on his rifle until his knuckles showed white against the dark wood. Personal effects that could only have been taken from soldiers, a young man's daguerreotype showing a pretty girl in a wedding dress, a gold wedding ring that still seemed to hold the warmth of human touch letters from home, written in a woman's careful handwriting that spoke of love and longing and the hope that her soldier would return safely from the frontier. Mixed among these poignant reminders of lives cut short were official documents, transfer orders for horses between military posts, but with destinations that had been altered using different ink in a hand that wasn't quite skillful enough to hide the forgery. More damning still were requisition forms for supplies that would never reach their intended recipients. Sweet Mary and Joseph. Winona whispered, her German accent thickening with shock as she took in the full scope of what they had discovered. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In a corner of the chamber, partially hidden by a canvas tarp, Kime found a wooden crate that contained items no legitimate mining operation would need: blood-stained cavalry uniforms, torn and bearing the marks of violence, along with a leather-bound journal that made his blood run cold. The journal belonged to Private Thomas Mitchell of the 7th Cavalry, and its final entries painted a picture of growing suspicion and mounting fear. March 15th. Something ain't right about these horse transfers. Sergeant Webb keeps changing the destination orders, and the horses we're supposed to be moving don't match the requisition lists. Asked Morrison about it, but he just told me to mind my own business and follow orders. March 18th. Found horse tracks leading toward the old mine instead of the Colorado road like Webb claimed. When I mentioned it to Corporal Hayes, he got real nervous and told me to forget what I'd seen. Starting to think we're not the only ones involved in this operation. March 22nd. Webb knows I suspect something. Caught him and Morrison talking in low voices, and they stopped when they saw me. Morrison's been watching me real close, and I don't think it's just military discipline. I'm going to try to get word to Fort Collins about what's happening here, but I'm not sure who I can trust. The final entry was dated March 23rd, and the handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste or fear they know. Morrison came to me with orders to ride out alone to check the southern approach, but I heard Webb tell him to make sure I don't come back. I'm going to try to hide this journal where someone might find it if I don't make it. If you're reading this, know that Sergeant Webb and his men are stealing army horses and killing soldiers to cover their tracks. Don't trust anyone in uniform until you know which side they're on. My God, Vale whispered, reading over Keme's shoulder. I knew some of it, but not this. Not murder. The implications hit Winona like a physical blow. Heinrich, she said, her voice barely audible. He found this place, didn't he? He discovered what was happening here, and they killed him for it. She pulled out her husband's geological reports with trembling hands, studying the coded notations with new understanding. What she had taken for technical observations now revealed themselves as desperate attempts to document evidence of criminal activity without putting it in plain writing that could be discovered by the wrong people. One notation in particular caught her attention: W plus M23. März, unnatürliche Todesfälle, Sergeant Webb plus Morrison, March 23rd, unnatural deaths. Heinrich had witnessed something on that date, something that had signed his own death warrant. They didn't just steal horses. Keme said grimly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had suddenly understood the true scope of the evil they were facing. They murdered soldiers to cover their tracks, then reported the men as deserters to explain their disappearance. How many? Winona asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Vale was examining other documents scattered around the chamber, his face growing paler with each revelation. At least 6 soldiers over the past 8 months. Maybe more. Webb's been running this operation like a military campaign, systematic and thorough. The sound of boots in the main tunnel cut short their investigation, accompanied by Webb's voice, carrying clearly through the rock walls, with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Search every side tunnel, every alcove. They're in here somewhere, and we can't afford to let witnesses walk away from what they've seen. Kemi began stuffing the most incriminating documents into his coat, while Winona gathered the personal effects that would provide proof of the soldiers' murders, if they could get this evidence to the territorial authorities in Cheyenne. Webb's entire operation would collapse, and justice might finally be served for the men who had died for the crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes, as armed men closed in on their position with the methodical precision of a military sweep operation designed to leave no witnesses alive. The lamp flames flickered as moving air suggested someone approaching through the tunnel system, and Keme drew his knife while positioning himself between the entrance and Winona, who was trying desperately to keep Henrik quiet, despite the baby's growing fussiness at being confined in the underground darkness for so long. A shadow appeared in the tunnel mouth, followed by the barrel of a rifle that caught the lamplight like a promise of death. The figure stepped into the chamber and revealed itself to be Morrison, and the same soldier whose name had appeared in Private Mitchell's journal, a bearded man whose eyes held the flat calm of someone who had killed before, and would do so again without hesitation. Morrison's eyes widened as he took in the scene, the scattered evidence, the incriminating documents spread across the table, and most importantly, the witnesses who could destroy everything he and his partners had worked to build. His rifle came up to his shoulder with professional speed. "Sergeant," he called out, his voice echoing through the tunnels like a death knell. "Found them. They're in the storage chamber, and they've seen everything." Kemi threw his knife in the same instant Morrison fired the blade, spinning through the lamplight, to take the soldier in the shoulder and spoil his aim so that the bullet sparked off the rock wall inches from Winona's head. The confined space filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and stone dust, while Henrik's cries rose to a pitch that spoke of pure terror. Morrison staggered, but didn't go down, his military training keeping him functional despite the pain as he reached for his sidearm with his good hand. Keme rushed forward, grappling for control of the pistol, while Winona pressed herself against the far wall, shielding Henrik with her body and looking for any weapon she could use to help. More voices echoed from the tunnels, Webb and at least 2 other men alerted by the gunshot, and moving fast toward the chamber, where their carefully guarded secrets were being exposed to daylight for the first time. Time was running out, and their options were dwindling rapidly. "The powder kegs," Winona said urgently, pointing to several small barrels stacked near the entrance. Heinrich always said mining was mostly about knowing when and where to make the earth move. Keme understood immediately. He broke away from Morrison's weakening grip and grabbed one of the smaller kegs, noting the DuPont logo and the stenciled cautions about proper handling that decorated the wood like promises of destruction. If he could create a controlled collapse, it might seal the tunnel and give them time to escape through other passages Heinrich had mapped. Morrison raised his pistol with his good hand, his face twisted with pain and determination. But Winona was faster than either man expected. She snatched up a mining pick that Heinrich had left leaning against the wall and brought the wooden handle down on Morrison's wrist with surprising force, the impact producing an audible crack of breaking bone. The gun clattered across the stone floor as Morrison cursed and clutched his injured arm, his military discipline finally overcome by pain and the realization that his situation was rapidly deteriorating beyond recovery. Webb's voice was very close now, perhaps 20 yards away in the main tunnel, his words carrying the cold authority of a career soldier who had made a decision to eliminate a problem permanently. "Morrison, report your situation. What's happening in that chamber?" Keme positioned the powder keg near a support timber that looked crucial to the tunnel's structural integrity, and began preparing a short fuse using black powder from his ammunition pouch, his hands working with the steady precision of a man who understood that one mistake would kill them all. "How long after you light it?" Winona asked, understanding the plan immediately and already moving toward the passage that Heinrich's map showed, leading to other parts of the mine system. 30 seconds, maybe less. Keme replied, striking a lucifer and watching the small flame dance in the underground air. "Can you find the way out with Henrik?" "I'll have to." The sound of approaching boots echoed off the stone walls like a countdown to disaster, and Webb's voice carried clearly through the rock. "Morrison, answer me immediately. What's your status in there?" Keme touched the flame to his improvised fuse and watched it begin to burn with a bright, hissing light that cast dancing shadows on the chamber walls like demons celebrating the approach of destruction. "Move," he ordered, pushing Winona toward the narrow passage that represented their only hope of escape. They ran through the darkness as fast as the treacherous footing would allow, following Heinrich's careful mapping while the fuse burned behind them with inexorable purpose. The passage was narrow and twisted, carved by decades of water seepage and the occasional blast to improve ventilation. But it led away from the main tunnel system toward chambers that Webb and his men might not know existed. Behind them, Webb's voice rose to a shout as he entered the chamber and saw the burning fuse that would bring down tons of rock in a matter of seconds. "Get out, everybody out, the whole section's about to blow." The explosion, when it came, was both louder and more controlled than Keme had dared hope. The carefully placed charge brought down the tunnel roof in a collapse that sealed the chamber, but didn't cause the entire mine system to cave in catastrophically. Dust and debris filled the air like a brown fog, and for several minutes the only sounds were the settling of disturbed rock and the distant shouts of Webb's men trying to assess the damage. They emerged from a ventilation shaft nearly a quarter-mile from the main entrance, gasping and covered with rock dust, but alive and free, at least temporarily. Henrik was crying lustily, a sound that had never been more welcome to his mother's ears, proof that he had survived the underground ordeal without serious harm. "They'll find another way around," Keme said, helping Winona to her feet while scanning the surrounding hills for signs of immediate pursuit. "Webb knows these tunnels better than we do, and he'll be more determined than ever to silence us permanently." But even as he spoke, they could see riders emerging from concealed positions around the mine's perimeter. Webb and at least 4 of his men, mounted on cavalry horses, and already beginning to spread out in a search pattern designed to cut off all possible escape routes. Webb's voice carried across the hillside, cold and implacable as winter wind. "No witnesses. You all know what that means. Find them and finish this, no matter what it takes." The game had changed completely, escalating from a simple investigation into a deadly hunt where failure meant death for all of them. But they now possessed evidence that could destroy Webb's entire operation if they could survive long enough to get it to the authorities who might actually be willing to act on it. The wind on the ridge cut through their clothes like cavalry sabers, and Henrik's cries had grown progressively weaker over the past hour. A development that worried Winona more than the approaching riders or the gunshots that occasionally echoed across the valley. The stress of their ordeal had completely dried up her milk supply, and the baby was slowly starving despite their best efforts to keep him warm and calm in the harsh wilderness. Below them, Webb's men had spread out in a methodical search pattern, working their way up the hillside with the precision of experienced hunters who understood their prey's limitations. There was no panic in their movements, no wasted effort. They knew the terrain intimately, and they understood that their quarry had limited options for escape, with an infant slowing them down. Keme chewed his last piece of hardtack into a soft paste, then used a corner of torn cloth to feed it to Henrik, drop by drop the liquid mixing with saliva to create something the infant's stomach might be able to process. It was a technique his wife had taught him during their brief marriage when winter food shortages meant children had to be kept alive by any means available. "Where did you learn that?" Winona asked, watching his gentle movements, with an expression that mixed surprise and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. "Little Crow Woman showed me many things about caring for children," he replied quietly, his voice carrying grief that time had softened, but not erased. "She said the spirits sometimes test us by sending babies when we're least prepared to care for them, but they also provide the knowledge we need if we're wise enough to accept it." "Were you—" Winona hesitated, then forged ahead with the directness that had marked her character since childhood. "Were you happy with her?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, carrying implications that went far beyond simple curiosity about his past marriages. Keme continued feeding Henrik while considering how to answer honestly, without revealing feelings that might complicate their already impossible situation. "I was grateful for her presence," he said, finally choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. "She deserved better than gratitude, but gratitude and respect were what I had to offer at the time. I think she understood that some wounds take longer to heal than others." A rifle shot cracked across the valley like breaking timber, followed by answering shouts from Webb's searchers that suggested they had found something tracks disturbed vegetation, or perhaps just a better vantage point for the next phase of their systematic hunt. "We can't keep running with Henrik in this condition." Winona said, her voice tight with the desperate fear of a mother watching her child slip away, despite everything she could do to save him. "He needs proper food and warmth, and he needs them soon." That was when Deputy Vale appeared through the scattered pines, like an answer to desperate prayer, leading 2 horses and carrying supplies that spoke of careful preparation rather than hasty flight. His face was grim but determined as he approached their position, moving with the careful steps of a man who had finally chosen his side in a conflict that had been tearing him apart for months. "Figured you might need help," he said, pulling medical supplies and food from his saddlebags with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this intervention for hours. "After what we found in that mine, I decided it was time to stop pretending I could stay neutral in this fight." Vale's change of heart had been prompted by more than guilt over his previous cooperation with Webb's criminal enterprise. The evidence they had uncovered in the hidden chamber had made it brutally clear that anyone who knew about the operation was now a liability to be eliminated rather than a resource to be managed. His own survival depended on Webb's defeat as much as theirs did. "There's a line shack about 2 miles north of here," Vale explained, helping to rebandage Keem's wounded hand with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. "Used to be a hunting lodge before the drought made game scarce in these parts. It's got a stone fireplace and enough split wood to last through the night, plus some basic supplies that hunters left behind when they moved on to better territory." "Why should we trust you after everything that's happened?" Winona asked, studying the deputy's face with the calculating expression of someone who had learned to evaluate trustworthiness as a matter of life and death. "Because you don't have any other choice," Vale replied with brutal honesty that cut through pretense and politeness. "And because I'd rather die trying to save a baby than live knowing I let one freeze to death for the sake of my own convenience." As they prepared to follow Vale toward whatever shelter awaited them in the wilderness, Keme couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into a trap that had been carefully prepared by men who understood the value of patience in hunting dangerous prey. But with Henrik growing weaker by the hour and Webb's riders closing in from multiple directions, they had no choice but to trust the deputy's apparent redemption and hope it was genuine rather than another layer of deception in an already complex game. The line shack proved to be exactly what Vale had promised, a small but sturdy log structure tucked into a grove of pines that provided both shelter and concealment from casual observation. The stone fireplace drew properly, and soon they had a fire crackling that began to drive the deadly cold from the single room while casting dancing shadows on the chinked log walls. More importantly, Vale had brought a nursing goat tethered behind his pack horse, a detail that spoke of forethought and genuine concern for Henrik's welfare. Within minutes, Winona was able to feed her son properly for the first time in days, and the baby's color began to improve as warm milk filled his empty stomach. "How did you know?" she asked, watching Henrik nurse contentedly, while tears of relief tracked down her cheeks. "Had a baby sister who almost starved when my mother's milk failed during a hard winter," Vale replied, tending the fire with methodical precision. "Never forgot how close we came to losing her, or how grateful we were to the neighbor who shared his goat's milk until things got better." As Henrik finally slept peacefully in his mother's arms, the three adults settled around the fire to plan their next moves. The evidence they had gathered was damning, but getting it to authorities who would act on it was another matter entirely. Webb had connections throughout the territorial government, and many officials would be reluctant to believe accusations against a decorated army sergeant without overwhelming proof. "We need more than documents and personal effects," Keme said, studying Heinrich's coded notes by firelight. "We need someone in authority who can't be bought or intimidated into ignoring what we've found." "Judge Nichols in Cheyenne," Vale suggested. "He's got a reputation for honesty, and he's not beholden to local interests the way territorial appointees sometimes are. But getting word to him means crossing country that Webb and his men know better than we do." Winona had been quiet during this discussion, but now she spoke with a resolution that surprised both men. "There's another way. Heinrich wasn't the only one keeping records of what he saw. If Webb has been operating for months, there might be other witnesses, other families who lost men under suspicious circumstances. We need to gather their testimonies and present a case that's too strong to ignore." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, moving slowly and carefully through the timber in a pattern that suggested reconnaissance rather than direct assault. Vale doused the oil lamp immediately, leaving only the firelight that couldn't be seen from outside if they kept away from the windows. "How many?" Keme whispered, moving to a position where he could observe the approaches without exposing himself to rifle fire. "At least 3, maybe 4. Vale replied, checking his weapons with the practiced efficiency of a lawman who had faced dangerous situations before. "They're being cautious, which means they suspect we're here, but aren't certain of our exact position. Through a gap in the chinked logs, they could see movement in the tree-lined dark shapes that might have been men or horses advancing with the patience of hunters who understood that rushing their prey would only result in escape or unsuccessful confrontation. We could make a run for the back country," Vale suggested quietly. "There's rough terrain to the north that would make pursuit difficult, especially in the dark." "Not with Henrik," Winona said firmly. "He's finally warm and fed. I won't risk his life unless there's no other choice." That was when they heard Webb's voice, closer than expected and carrying clearly through the cold night air. "I know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible and we can discuss this like civilized people. Nobody needs to get hurt if you're willing to be reasonable." The offer was almost certainly a lie. Men who had already committed multiple murders weren't likely to show mercy to witnesses who could destroy them, but it bought them a few precious minutes to consider their extremely limited options. "What does he want?" Winona whispered. "The evidence destroyed and the witnesses silenced." Keme replied grimly. "He can't afford to let us live, not after what we've seen and documented." Vale was studying the positions of Webb's men through cracks in the log walls, his experience as a lawman helping him evaluate their tactical situation. "They've got us surrounded, but they're being careful about it. Webb knows we're armed and dangerous, and he doesn't want to lose any more men to what he probably sees as a minor cleanup operation. "How long until dawn?" Winona asked. 4 hours, maybe 5, Vale replied. "But I don't think Webb's planning to wait that long. He'll want this finished before there's enough light for anyone to see what's happening from a distance." The waiting stretched on like torture, punctuated by occasional sounds of movement in the surrounding forest and the soft whisper of wind through pine boughs. Henrik slept peacefully, unaware that his young life hung in the balance of decisions being made by desperate men in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. Then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to climb onto the roof, probably intending to drop something down the chimney or find another way into the cabin that would bypass their defensive positions at the windows and door. "Smoke them out." Webb's voice carried from the tree line. "If they won't come out voluntarily, we'll give them motivation to reconsider their stubbornness." Vale was already moving, grabbing a bucket of water they had drawn from the nearby stream and positioning himself near the fireplace. "They're going to try to fill the cabin with smoke, force us to come out where they can shoot us down in the open." But Kemi had a different idea, one that would require split-second timing and considerable risk. "When they drop whatever they're planning to drop down that chimney, we go out the back window. You take Henrik and head for the horses. Winona and I will create a distraction that draws their attention away from your escape route." "I'm not leaving you," Winona said firmly. "You're not leaving me," Kame replied. "You're making sure Henrik survives to grow up and learn the truth about his father's death. That's more important than what happens to any of us tonight." Before she could argue further, the sound of splintering wood and falling debris announced that Webb's men had succeeded in their attempt to compromise the cabin's chimney. Smoke began pouring into the single room with alarming speed, and they had only seconds before the atmosphere became unbreathable. "Now," Keme ordered, and then chaos erupted as 3 adults and 1 infant moved with desperate precision toward what might be their last chance at survival. The window glass shattered under Vale's boot as he kicked it out, creating an escape route just large enough for a man carrying a baby. He passed Henrik to Winona, then helped her through the opening, while Keme provided covering fire toward the positions where Webb's men were waiting for them to emerge from the front door. "Get to the horses," Vale whispered urgently. "If we don't make it out, ride hard for Cheyenne and don't stop for anything or anyone." The plan worked for exactly 30 seconds. Then rifle fire erupted from multiple positions as Webb's men realized their prey was escaping through an exit they hadn't adequately covered. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass, while muzzle flashes lit up the forest like deadly fireflies. Vale took a bullet in the shoulder that spun him around and nearly dropped him. But he managed to stay on his feet and return fire while Winona ran for the horses with Henrik clutched against her chest. Keme provided what covering fire he could, but their ammunition was limited, and their enemies had both superior numbers and better defensive positions. "This way," Keme called out, leading them away from the cabin toward rougher terrain, where the horses would be less useful but the darkness might provide better concealment. "Stay low and keep moving." Behind them, the cabin was fully engulfed in flames that lit up the night sky like a signal fire advertising their position to anyone within miles, but also creating enough smoke and confusion to mask their exact escape route. Webb's voice could be heard above the crackle of burning logs, organizing his men for pursuit, with the calm efficiency of a career soldier who had dealt with tactical setbacks before. They reached the horses just as Morrison appeared through the smoke and firelight, his wounded shoulder roughly bandaged, but his rifle steady as he drew a bead on Winona's back. There was no time for warning. No opportunity for negotiation, only the split-second choice between action and watching an innocent woman die for the crime of seeking justice for her murdered husband. Keme's shot took Morrison in the chest, dropping him instantly, but the sound brought immediate response from Webb's other men. They had perhaps 60 seconds before the position would be overrun by superior numbers, with nothing to lose and everything to protect. "Ride!" Vale ordered, boosting Winona into the saddle of his strongest horse and placing the reins in her hands. "Don't look back, don't stop, and don't trust anyone in uniform until you reach Judge Nichols in Cheyenne." "What about you?" she asked, but Vale was already turning back toward the approaching sound of pursuit. "Buying you time," he replied simply. "Take care of that baby and make sure the truth gets told." The ride through the wilderness became a nightmare of desperate flight, punctuated by moments of terror when Webb's pursuit came too close for comfort. Keme led the way through terrain he knew from his scouting work, choosing paths that would be difficult to follow in darkness, but that gradually led them toward the main road to Cheyenne. Henrik cried intermittently, despite Winona's best efforts to soothe him, his thin wails carrying farther in the cold air than any of them would have liked. But the baby's distress was nothing compared to his mother's anguish as she realized the full scope of what they had uncovered and what it meant for their chances of survival. "Heinrich knew," she said as they paused to rest the horses in a sheltered draw. "He found evidence of what Webb was doing, and they killed him for it. Made it look like an accident, but it was murder just like all the others." The coded notations in her husband's geological reports now made terrible sense, not technical observations about mineral deposits, but desperate attempts to document criminal activity without creating evidence that could be used against him if discovered by the wrong people. Heinrich Müller had died trying to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial and military authority. "We have proof now." Keme said, though he wondered if proof would be enough against men with Webb's connections and resources. "The question is whether we can live long enough to present it to someone who will act on it." Dawn found them on the main road to Cheyenne, their horses exhausted and their own strength nearly spent from the night of flight and fear. But behind them, the smoke of the burned cabin marked their trail like a beacon, and they knew Webb would not give up the pursuit as long as witnesses to his crimes remained alive. The territorial capital was still 2 days hard riding away, and they had no guarantee that reaching it would mean safety or justice. But it was their only chance, and they took it with the desperate hope of people who had already lost everything except their lives and the truth they carried. What they found when they finally reached Cheyenne would determine not only their own fates, but the fate of justice itself in a territory where law and order were still struggling to take root in soil watered with too much blood and corruption. The railroad trestle spanning Bitter Creek Canyon had been built to last, its iron framework rising like a monument to progress and commerce in the Wyoming wilderness. But on this particular night, it would serve as the stage for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would triumph in a territory still finding its moral compass. Before leaving for Cheyenne, Kame had taken one crucial precaution that would prove decisive in the coming confrontation. He had sent Dr. Hart a coded message using signs his wife had taught him from their shared knowledge of frontier communication, instructing her to alert Sheriff Pike if they failed to return by a specific time. The message was hidden in a way that Webb's men would not recognize as significant. But Hart's experience with diverse patients had taught her to recognize emergency signals from various cultures. Webb and his remaining men had commandeered the evening freight train, converting it into an improvised field office for their final escape attempt. The locomotive and 3 freight cars carried not only their stolen horses and accumulated loot, but also the equipment necessary to establish their criminal enterprise in new territory where their past wouldn't follow them. "Everything loaded," Webb called out to Morrison, who was directing the final phase of their evacuation, with military precision, despite his wounded shoulder. "Last of the horses are secured, Sergeant," Morrison replied, checking the manifest that would help them establish their new identities once they reached sanctuary across the Colorado border. Silver ore from the Muller cache is in the second car, along with enough supplies to last until we can establish new operations. But Webb's carefully laid plans had not accounted for the determination of two desperate fugitives and a baby whose very existence represented a threat to their carefully constructed future. Keme and Winona approached the trestle from downstream, using the creek bed as concealment, while they studied the loading operation that represented Webb's final attempt to escape justice. Henrik slept fitfully in his mother's arms, wrapped in blankets that provided warmth but also muffled any sounds that might give away their position. "Remember the plan," Keme whispered as they moved into position beneath the trestle's iron framework. "Disable the track, scatter the horses, destroy the ore shipment that would finance their operations elsewhere. If we can delay them long enough, help should arrive." The plan was based on Heinrich's engineering knowledge preserved in his notes and adapted for sabotage rather than construction. The trestle's structure included maintenance access points that would allow them to weaken key supports without bringing down the entire span, creating enough damage to strand the train while keeping their own escape routes open. Winona had insisted on participating despite the obvious dangers to herself and Henrik. "This is for Heinrich," she said with the quiet determination that had carried her through months of grief and desperation. "He died trying to stop these men. I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless." Working with tools salvaged from the burned line shack, they began the delicate process of loosening critical bolts and weakening key structural elements. The work was slow and dangerous, requiring them to climb among the iron girders while remaining invisible to the armed guards Webb had posted around the loading operation. Above them, they could hear Webb coordinating the final phases of evacuation with the confidence of a man who believed he had eliminated all threats to his carefully planned escape. The sergeant's voice carried clearly in the cold night air as he issued orders with military precision. "Priority items loaded first," he was saying. "Personal effects from the mine stay behind too much risk of identification if we're stopped for inspection. We travel light and fast, establish new identities in Colorado, then begin operations again within 6 months." "What about witnesses?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying unease about loose ends they might be leaving behind. "No witnesses left alive," Webb replied with cold certainty. "The Indian and the German woman died in that cabin fire, and Vale won't be talking to anyone about what he might have seen or suspected." But even as Webb spoke those words, his confidence was being undermined by the systematic sabotage taking place beneath his feet. Keme had identified the critical load-bearing points that would cause maximum delay, with minimum risk to innocent trainmen, while Winona used her husband's engineering notes to ensure their work would be effective but not catastrophic. The sound of approaching horses from the direction of Bitter Creek made them freeze in their dangerous positions among the trestle's girders. But instead of Webb's reinforcements, the riders proved to be Sheriff Pike leading a hastily assembled posse of townsmen who had finally decided to act on the evidence that Dr. Hart had presented to them. "Webb," Pike's voice carried across the canyon with official authority backed by righteous anger. "You're under arrest for theft of military property conspiracy to defraud the territorial government and the murder of 6 United States soldiers." The response was immediate and violent. Webb's men opened fire from defensive positions around the train, their muzzle flashes lighting up the night like deadly fireworks, while bullets whined off iron and stone in all directions. "Take cover and return fire." Pike ordered his posse, spreading out among the rocks and timber that provided natural defensive positions along the canyon rim. "We've got them trapped, but watch out for civilian hostages." The battle that followed was brief, but intense, with neither side willing to give quarter in what both understood to be a final confrontation. Webb's men had superior defensive positions and military training. But Pike's posse had moral authority and the determination of citizens who had finally seen enough corruption in their community. In the chaos of gunfire and shouted orders, Kime and Winona completed their sabotage work and began the dangerous descent from the trestle framework to the creek bed below. But their movement caught Morrison's attention, and he turned his rifle toward them with deadly intent. "Sergeant," Morrison called out. "The witnesses are still alive. They're trying to escape downstream." Webb's response was to abandon his defensive position and pursue them personally, understanding that their survival represented the end of everything he had worked to build. He reached the creek bank just as Winona was helping Henrik down to the water's edge. His rifle trained on the baby, with the calculated ruthlessness of a man who had already crossed every moral line. "That's far enough." Webb snarled his voice, carrying the cold certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Drop whatever weapons you're carrying and step away from the water, or I'll put a bullet through that baby's head." Winona froze, clutching Henrik against her chest while calculating the distance to the nearest cover and finding it impossibly far. Webb was less than 20 feet away, close enough that even a poor shot would be fatal to either her or her son. "I'm unarmed," she said, though she still carried Kime's broken knife hidden in her coat, useless as a weapon in its current condition, but representing her only hope if an opportunity presented itself. "Then you won't mind proving it," Webb replied, beginning to close the distance between them with the careful steps of a predator who had cornered his prey and was savoring the moment of victory. That was when Kemi put his knowledge of the terrain to deadly use. From his position upstream, he triggered a small rock slide by loosening stones that had been weakened by frost and spring runoff. The sudden crash and shower of debris distracted Webb for a crucial second, drawing his attention away from Winona and toward the source of the unexpected noise. In that moment, Winona proved that months of desperation had taught her more about survival than Webb had given her credit for. She pulled the broken knife from her coat with her free hand and struck at Webb's rifle arm with desperate strength, the blade's remaining edge cutting deep enough to spoil his aim and send his shot wide. But Webb was a 20-year veteran of frontier warfare, and a flesh wound wasn't enough to stop him. He struck back with the rifle butt, catching Winona in the shoulder and spinning her around while she fought to maintain her grip on Henrik. That was when Kemi arrived, like an avenging spirit, having used the rock slide distraction to close the distance between them. His tackle carried both men into the creek with tremendous force, and the icy water became a battlefield where training fought desperation in a contest that could only end with one man dead. Webb was larger and more experienced, but Kemi had the advantage of fighting for something beyond his own survival. As they grappled in the numbing water, each man sought the leverage that would allow him to finish the fight permanently. "You should have stayed out of white man's business," Webb gasped, trying to get his hands around Keme's throat. "Should have stayed out of murder," Keme replied, using a wrestling technique his father had taught him to break Webb's grip and gain the upper hand. The fight was brutal and exhausting, neither man able to gain decisive advantage in the treacherous footing and numbing cold of the mountain creek. But gradually, Keem's younger strength and desperate motivation began to tell against Webb's military experience and superior size. When the end came, it was sudden and final. Webb made one last desperate attempt to reach the pistol in his belt, but the movement left him exposed to the leverage hold that Keme had been working toward throughout their struggle. The sharp crack of breaking bone echoed across the water, and Webb's body went limp as his neck snapped under pressure that he had brought upon himself through his final fatal mistake. Keme pulled himself from the creek, gasping and shivering, to find Winona sitting on the bank with Henrik clutched against her chest. The baby was crying lustily, which had never sounded more beautiful to his mother's ears, proof that he had survived the violence without physical harm. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of men calling to each other across the canyon, as Pike's posse secured the scene and arrested the surviving members of Webb's criminal enterprise. "It's over," Kame replied, pulling them both against his chest in an embrace that tasted of creekwater gunpowder and something that might have been hope emerging from the ashes of despair. Above them, the railroad trestle stood damaged, but still functional. A symbol of progress interrupted, but not destroyed by corruption and violence. The train would not be making its scheduled departure, and the men who had planned to profit from murder and theft would face territorial justice for their crimes. But more importantly, the truth would finally be told about Heinrich Müller's death and the soldiers who had died trying to do their duty in a wilderness where law and order were still struggling to take root in soil watered with too much blood. Dawn broke clear and cold over Bitter Creek, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and rose that made the night's violence seem like a distant nightmare. The freight train sat motionless on the damaged tracks, its cargo of stolen goods and evidence, providing proof of crimes that had corrupted the territory's military and civilian authority for nearly a year. Sheriff Pike supervised the arrest of Webb's surviving accomplices with the grim satisfaction of a lawman who had finally been able to serve justice instead of the interests of corrupt officials. Morrison and 2 other soldiers sat in shackles, their military careers ended, and their futures measured in years behind bars or at the end of hangman's ropes. Found this in Webb's personal effects. Pike said, handing Kemi a leather dispatch case that contained correspondence with officials in Colorado and New Mexico territories. "Looks like this operation was bigger than just stolen horses. They had connections reaching all the way to Santa Fe and Denver, with plans to expand throughout the Southwest." Hart worked tirelessly, treating the wounded from both sides, her medical ethics requiring her to care for criminals and lawmen alike, despite her personal feelings about the night's events. Deputy Vale had survived his wounds and was expected to make a full recovery, though he would carry the scars of his difficult choices for the rest of his life. "The baby needs proper medical attention," Hart observed, examining Henrik with professional thoroughness. "He survived the ordeal remarkably well, but prolonged stress and inadequate nutrition have taken their toll. With proper care, he should recover completely." Finch had arrived with the dawn, his notebook already filled with details of the night's events, and his scholarly mind working to understand the full scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. "This will require federal investigation," he announced, with the satisfaction of someone who understood the historical significance of what they had witnessed. Corruption of military personnel, conspiracy across territorial boundaries, multiple murders of federal soldiers, this goes far beyond local jurisdiction. But the most significant change was happening quietly away from official investigations and legal proceedings. Winona had taken residence in Dr. Hart's clinic while federal authorities conducted their investigation, and Kame found himself spending more time in town than his duties as an Army scout would normally require. 3 days after the confrontation at the railroad trestle, as Henrik slept peacefully in a proper crib donated by concerned townswomen, Kame and Winona walked together in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church. They placed wildflowers on Heinrich Müller's grave, while discussing a future neither had dared to imagine during their desperate flight from Webb's pursuit. "The federal investigator wants to offer you a position," Winona said, her voice carrying news that could change both their lives. "Special deputy to the U.S. Marshal. The pay would be good, and the work would keep you in Wyoming instead of traveling constantly for the Army. What do you think about that?" Kame asked, though he suspected he already knew her answer from the way she had been looking at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. "I think Heinrich would approve of work that prevented other families from suffering what we've suffered," she replied carefully. And I think Henrik will need a father figure as he grows up in a territory that can be dangerous for children without proper protection. They walked back toward town in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they navigated the uneven ground. To anyone watching from a distance, they looked like a family returning from an afternoon visit to remember the dead. But both understood that the reality was more complex and potentially more precious than simple appearances suggested. A week later, Territorial Judge Nichols arrived from Cheyenne with a team of federal investigators and prosecutors who would ensure that justice was finally served for the soldiers who had died and the families who had been victimized by Webb's criminal enterprise. Mallory's financial records revealed fraud on a scale that shocked even cynical frontier residents, and the banker's arrest led to the recovery of illegally seized property throughout the county. The territory is establishing a special fund for families affected by military corruption, Judge Nichols announced at a public meeting in the schoolhouse. Mrs. Muller and Mr. Keamy have been appointed as local administrators, ensuring that assistance reaches those who need it most. The appointment was unexpected but welcome, offering them the opportunity to work together on meaningful projects that could make a real difference in people's lives. More importantly, it provided stability for Henrik and a legitimate reason for Keme and Winona to build a life together in a community that had learned to value their courage and integrity. As spring turned toward summer, the changes in Bitter Creek became more pronounced. The railroad resumed normal operations, bringing legitimate commerce and honest settlers who were attracted by reports of justice served and corruption eliminated. Dr. Hart established a small hospital with federal funding, and Finch founded a newspaper that would document the territory's progress toward statehood. But the most significant change was happening in the small house near the creek, where Winona had established her new home. Keme spent increasing amounts of time there, helping with Henrik's care and gradually becoming part of a family structure that neither of them had explicitly defined, but both had come to treasure. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching Henrik take his first uncertain steps across the wooden planks, Winona finally asked the question that had been growing between them for months. "When you bought me at that auction," she said, her voice soft in the gathering twilight, "did you know who I was? Did you remember that little German girl from 20 years ago?" Keme was quiet for a long moment, watching Henrik explore his expanding world with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "I hoped," he said finally. "Your eyes, the way you held your chin when you were frightened, it reminded me of someone who had shown kindness to a wounded boy when she had every reason to be afraid. And now I know," he replied, taking her hand in his, with a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "Some debts transform into gifts when you're not paying careful attention to the change." As they sat together in the peaceful evening, listening to Henrik's delighted laughter and the sound of Bitter Creek flowing past their home, two lives that had been shaped by violence and loss found their way toward something that looked remarkably like happiness, built on a foundation of shared courage and hard-won trust. Behind them lay a cemetery full of those who had not survived to see this new beginning, their sacrifices remembered and honored by people who understood the true cost of justice and redemption. Ahead lay a future full of uncertainty, but also possibility in a territory that was finally learning to choose hope over fear law, over corruption, and love over the bitter legacy of old wounds. On a perfect summer evening in 1880 in the growing town of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, a Lakota warrior, a German widow, and a baby who would grow up knowing he was wanted and protected, took their first steps together toward whatever family meant when it was chosen with love, rather than simply endured from obligation. The circle that had begun with a terrified child saving a wounded boy had finally closed, transformed by time and circumstance, into something deeper and more lasting than either could have imagined during their desperate flight from those who would have destroyed them. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, not the sound of criminals fleeing justice, but of legitimate commerce and honest progress in a land that was finally ready to fulfill its promise of freedom and opportunity for all who were willing to work for it.